And I just feel like a Zoom novice.
Yeah. Well, speaking of this, you see my green screen? Is that so people know they're in the right place? Is that what you see, Colleen?
You've got it right, yes.
Hello.
For those of you who are kind of already here, just so you know, we already are on YouTube. Just for your awareness, just so you know, we'll be getting started about 1 minute. Give a few more people a chance to log on.
Do you mind if we call in?
Charles, can you hear me? I can't hear you, Charles. I can see you shake your head.
Hello?
Archie, I can hear you.
Okay, good, good.
Yeah, we
good,
can hear you.
Good, thanks.
I think they're just having trouble over at Charles' office.
Charles, I may have to pull off a little bit before 3. I have court this evening. I assume he heard me.
I think he did. He's very focused on his screen.
Archie, I'll make note of that. I'll make sure.
Thank you,
No
thank you
problem.
very much. Thank you.
Doing now? Can you hear me now?
Ah, yes.
Yes.
Very good. Well, great. Well, thanks everybody. Let's go ahead and get started since I'm up and running again, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. This is a really good group. Glad to see all these faces joining us this afternoon. This is going to be a little different than some of our other meetings because we are bringing together on purpose people who have been in sector committee conversations, which are very focused on specific actions and strategies that the state needs to take to kind of meet our greenhouse goals. And we also have advisory group members who we've been asking to think critically about all those actions and to think about the consequences. And we're all here in the same room. So I think I would hope we would just be able to appreciate that. About some of us are coming from it at this issue from slightly different points of view. And I know we'll have a good conversation today. And then I would just say too that we do want to think about actions, but we want to think about how to make them better. So I do think that this combination of folks is going to be helpful for that. Let's see. There we go. We don't have a formal minutes or anything to approve, but we do have an agenda to keep us on track and on time. And so I'll just kind of walk you through what our goals are and what we're going to do when. So first, we'll let everybody introduce themselves in just a second. I will give some background on just kind of the topic as it's been raised and as we understand it to help kind of frame the conversation. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time letting you all talk to one another about, the ins and outs of it, the pros and cons and all those good things. And then we'll have a few next steps, but we will have a public comment period at the very end, just in case there are people who are watching along that want to ask a question, or if we've received any input through the email. So that's going to be our plan. So I guess I'd love to start with introductions first, if we could. We have a good number of us here, so please take under a minute or less to kind of just tell us your name and your affiliation, who you're with, what groups on the climate task force you're associated with, whether you're on the task force, the sector committee, advisory group, or all three. And then third, if you have time, something you're looking forward to talking about in the discussion today. So that's just going to be our plan, to try to keep it short and sweet. And I will just go ahead and call on people so that I know that everybody's been hit. And so Stacy, you are first on my screen. Would you mind introducing yourself to us, please?
Sure. Thanks, Charles. Yeah, my name is Stacy Methvin. I have several affiliations, but I had a long-term career with Shell Oil Company in upstream, midstream, and downstream. I also serve on the Louisiana Governor's Advisory Commission for a long time, since probably 2002. On the task force, I'm on a sector committee, I guess. I was trying to remember what it's called. Is it mining, oil and gas or something? Or am I close, Charles?
You got it.
I'm on so many different things. But anyway, so that's what I serve on. And today I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think carbon pricing is an important subject. It's controversial, but it's something that I'd like to hear others' opinions on and see if we can make something work in Louisiana. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Stacy. Archie Hall, can you go next, please?
Thank you. Yeah, Archie Hall. I'm with Siemens. I've worked in this sector for over 20 some odd years, and I've worked in several states concerning developing and also implementing some energy projects at different levels, federal, state, and local. I also am looking forward to this area because I think ultimately this area is pretty much the combination of everything that we do. And this is going to be very, very important, especially when it comes to trying to get the private sector on board. So I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Archie. Ron, would you go next, please? I think you're on mute still, Ron. Would you?
Is that better?
Yes, that's a lot better.
All this technology, it confuses me sometimes. My name is Ron Harrell. I'm with the Louisiana Farm Bureau. I'm a member of the Ag, Forestry, Conservation and Waste Sector Committee. And I too think that carbon pricing is going to be key in this entire process. So I'm very thankful of being part of this group and looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. Karen, can you go next? Karen Sokol, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Karen Sokol. I'm a professor at Loyola College of Law, and I'm on the legal advisory group. I am looking forward to learning a lot about this, as well as the interaction of carbon pricing mechanisms with other forms of climate policy and regulation. Thanks.
Thank you. Naveen.
Hi there, my name is Naveen Adismili. I'm an economist with the LSU Ag Center, and I'm part of this Agricultural, Forestry, and Conservation Committee. Other affiliations, I'm the chair for the National Science and Policy Committee with the Soil and Water Conservation Society, and I'm also the co-chair for the SERA 46, which is a national consortium of land-grant universities dealing with the nutrient management in the Mississippi watershed. And I'm familiar with the carbon pricing concepts and happy to share anything I can. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Brandon Nelson, can you go next?
Sure. Thank you. So I'm a banker by day, but in this particular capacity, I chair the Coalition for Coastal Resilience and Economy, which is a neutral, nonpartisan group of business leaders who essentially want to make sure everyone's informed, educated, and trying to provide a voice of advocacy for sustainable restoration efforts. This is under the umbrella of GNO Inc., which is the economic development entity here in New Orleans. And so in that capacity, my interest tends to come from more of a economic development perspective, impacting the workforce, equity and inclusion, things of that nature. And I serve on the Finance Advisory Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Selby Bush, can you go next, please?
Sure. Hello. Hi, I'm Selby Bush, the head of corporate affairs for BHP. I sit on the Climate Initiatives Task Force and also the Mining and Oil and Gas Sector Committee, which makes a lot of sense. For those of you not familiar with BHP, we're actually the world's largest mining company. Here in the US, we're one of the largest producers in deepwater oil and gas, so also have interest in petroleum. We have our own goal of net zero by 2050, which matches up with Governor John Bel Edwards' goal. Today, I'm looking forward to learning from an incredibly diverse group on viewpoints on how we move forward toward our goals set on the task force. So really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you very much. Charles Allen, can you go next?
Yes, I'm Charles Allen, Director of Community Engagement of the National Audubon Society. I'm also a member of our Equity Advisory Group of our state's Climate Initiatives Task Force. And within Audubon, I also work as a member of our larger team focused on equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. And in terms of carbon pricing, I just am eager to hear more so I can further wrap my mind around this concept and see how our state can benefit from this going forward.
Thank you, Charles. Steve, can you go next, Steve Cochran?
Hey, thanks, Charles. A couple of things here. I am a member of the Equity Advisory Group for the task force. I work at Environmental Defense Fund, largely on coastal adaptation based here in New Orleans. But I've been at EDF for 25 years, and part of that career was running EDF's climate program. So I have some familiarity with cap and trade and carbon pricing. And so I'm curious about two things here. One is very much how people are thinking about how that might work in Louisiana on a state basis. It's very, very interesting to me. It's very curious. And then two, I am curious about how, as we think about policy here, how we think about equity and justice in a state which has a very high level of historic harm for those particular areas. So it's been a challenge on cap and trade programs as they've been developed over the years, and certainly will be here. And I'm curious to understand how people might be thinking about that as well.
Thank you, Steve. Mark Davis, can you go next?
I can. I'm Mark Davis, and I work at Tulane University, where I wear a couple of hats. My regular job is I direct the Institute on Water Resources Law and Policy. But I also direct, for the time being anyway, the Center for Environmental Law, which has a broader field of view, which certainly includes climate. And I also direct Tulane's Bywater Institute, which is its vehicle for encouraging and engaging multidisciplinary conversations and programs and projects across the campus focused on sustainability and resilience, and also with respect to community engagement. Charles Allen knows a little bit about that. He has history in that program's predecessor. I am also on the legal advisory committee for the governor's initiative.
Thank you, Mark. Eric Smith, can you go next?
Sure. I'm Eric Smith. I'm very interested in this particular subject. I've been involved with pricing of undesirable materials for some time, including the first effort in this regard, which had to do with tetraethyl lead here in Louisiana. But I also worked on the acid rain issues and some of the others. I'm particularly interested to see what people have to say about the pros and cons of carbon pricing versus cap and trade type programs.
Thank you. Glenn, can you go next?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Glenn Lyons. I'm with ExxonMobil. I am on the Mining, Oil, and Gas Production Sector Committee. ExxonMobil is very supportive of the goals of the task force, so I just want to start by mentioning that. Carbon pricing has been a long-standing pillar of our climate advocacy. So from that perspective, I mean, we're very eager and pleased to be able to participate in this call.
Thank you. Hunter Johnson, can you go next?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Hunter Johnston. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C. with the law firm of Steptoe and Johnson. Had a 30-something year career in Washington working with companies mostly in the energy industry. And presently, I work with several projects with ambition to capture CO2 and store it in non-EOR formations. I'm on the manufacturing subcommittee, and I look forward to talking to carbon pricing to see how we can encourage more decarbonization in Louisiana and the United States.
Thank you, Hunter. Gregory Bowser, can you go next?
There we go. Greg Bowser, I'm with the Louisiana Chemical Association. I'm particularly interested in carbon pricing to see how Louisiana does and see how we can make sure we're competitive with other states and to see how this plays on the national level, being that we represent multinational corporations that operate over the world. So for me, it's going to be both educational and exciting to see how we do this and be competitive in this arena. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nathan McBride.
Hey, I'm Nathan McBride. I'm with the Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association. I sit on the Manufacturing and Industry subcommittee, and I'm looking forward to hearing the conversation today to see what ideas are out there as far as this goes in Louisiana.
Thanks, Nathan. Stephen Barnes.
Hi, I'm Stephen Barnes. I'm director of the Kathleen Blanco Public Policy Center at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, and also an associate professor of economics in the Moody College of Business. I am on the Economics and Finance Advisory Group, and familiar with some of the economics research on the topic, but very, very much looking forward to today's discussion and hearing some of the different perspectives.
Thank you. Dr. Zhu Ning.
Good afternoon. My name is Zhu Ning. I'm on the Climate Initiative Land Use, Housing and Building Committee. My paid job is a professor and chair of the Urban Forestry, Environment and Natural Resource Department at Southern University. I'm also Southern University's UNSERS Institute Director. UNSERS stands for Air, Nutrient, Soil, Water, and Ecosystem and Remote Sensing. I also serve on the board of Ocean, Atmosphere, and Climate for the American Public Land Grant Universities. Directed some research and education projects funded by NSF, NASA, and USDA on climate change. I'm excited this afternoon to be with all of you to come up with some action items. Thank you.
Thank you. And Secretary Brown.
Good afternoon, all. I am Chuck Carl Brown. I'm the Secretary of Louisiana DEQ, member of the task force, also a board member of the Environmental Research Institute of the States, executive member of the Environmental Council of the States. I sit on the Keystone Energy Board, and recently, in the last few months, I've been engaged with the Nicholas Institute at Duke as we talk about funding and climate change. And my top priority would be to create a regional cap and trade program to deal with greenhouse gases. So interested to hear how this group wants to contribute to that. And I've already talked to several members who are going to be on the advisory committee to actually do some research. And I'd like to plug in the Nicholas Institute to those folks so we can come up with something that we think that can work for the state of Louisiana. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody that I missed that's a panelist? I mean, one of our committee members? Okay, then I just also want to introduce Colleen McHugh from the Water Institute of the Gulf. She's on our planning team. She'll be helping us today. And then obviously Lindsay Cooper, who I know most of you have met through other meetings. So we're all here to just kind of help keep this conversation going. So I guess the next thing I want to do is just provide a little bit of context for the meeting today, just so you kind of know how it fits into the larger process. This is a really great group. And so what I want you just to kind of see is that we do have, we are in the midst of action development, and Dr. Brown just mentioned that we're here to kind of, improve actions that are being worked on before that window closes. The due date is the end of this month. If you're on the sector committee, we'll be meeting again in mid-May after the deadline closes, so we can kind of consider all the different things that have come in through this process that are relating to your group. We are also we are working on a parallel track with the evaluation of strategy portfolios. So if you are on an advisory group, you'll be getting a survey from us sometime next week that'll have these hypothetical scenarios where we put a bunch of strategies together into a portfolio. We're asking you to kind of provide feedback on what those consequences might be. So we're both test driving. We're both trying to elicit some good information to put in front of the task force so they can help make decisions about these different hypothetical scenarios. But we're also kind of test driving our process of evaluating against our fundamental objectives. That might raise a bunch of questions, and so our planning team is going to have some office hours at the end of April or early May to kind of help you with that. So we'll be letting you know when exactly those will be, but that's part of the plan. But today is really all about actions still. So our goal is to improve the draft action proposals and identify new action proposals through this cross-disciplinary discussion where we have key technical, tactical, implementation issues all kind of thrown into one conversation. This is meeting 4 of 6. You can see the other topics on the side of the screen kind of in green. There'll be 2 more tomorrow, and all the prior meetings can be found on our YouTube page if you haven't watched. And you know, even tomorrow's meetings, you know, we planned them not to be concurrent, so you can listen in on other meetings if you're interested, but you can also go back and kind of hear them after the fact. The ground rules are really just easy. This is mostly about hearing from you all. This is a really experienced group, so we just want as much participation as we can get. We'd love you to share the floor when possible, and to try to stay focused on the actions. So we want to improve actions or develop new ones. We don't need to kind of completely evaluate them and kind of take them apart today, but we want to kind of try to get them as better if we can. And then so obviously our workshop topic is carbon pricing. We recognize, both through the conversations that we've had through sector committees and other places and kind of our research, that setting a price for carbon is an increasingly common strategy used in other states and countries. And there are a couple of different ways to do it. And there are plenty of considerations for how it's implemented that we should at least talk about and try to see how it would fit in the Louisiana context. And so again, you know, today we're hoping to just talk about some of the different mechanisms, really try to better understand the implications and the feasibility of some of those different mechanisms, and then of course develop and refine actions that are underway through that process. So now I'm going to do something pretty dangerous. I'm going to try to explain to a group of experts what this topic is. So bear with me, and I'm looking forward to hearing you guys improve this overview. But basically, you know, carbon pricing, the purpose of these policies is to try to capture the external costs of greenhouse gas emissions that are currently being paid through damages from climate impacts like increased flooding and many more, and provide an economic signal to help drive emissions reductions or to help drive investments into cleaner options. And so the idea is that with a cost placed on each ton of emitted greenhouse gases, then businesses and consumers are incentivized to take steps to reduce their emissions to avoid paying those costs. There are a couple of market-based solutions to this, market-based policies that we come up across a lot, and such as a direct carbon tax, emissions trading systems like cap and trade that's already been raised in this meeting, and then low carbon or alternative fuel standards are another example of those. The philosophy behind these market-based mechanisms is that, again, by putting a price signal, but not a specific policy or technology solution onto the carbon, the market can then find the most efficient and flexible way to reach the emissions reductions goals. You can also, you know, while you're at it, generate revenues for other goals if that's how you design it. Carbon taxes of these, you know, carbon taxes provide a higher level of certainty about what the actual costs that are going to be imposed are, but they're less certain about the emissions reductions that you can actually achieve through those policies. Whereas cap and trade systems kind of work in the opposite way. You set a firm emissions reductions goal, but then the price that is assigned to meeting those goals can vary based on how the market system operates. The second big bucket of carbon pricing is often known as the social cost of carbon. And those policies also place a dollar value on climate impacts associated with greenhouse gas emissions, but more so as an evaluation tool that can be used during decision making. And this can be internal to an agency or a private company or a government function. It's a way to compare, again, the benefits of emissions reductions to the cost of implementing any kind of mitigation policy. So, for example, the EPA used this calculation when they were in the rulemaking process for corporate average fuel economy standards, light-duty vehicle emission standards, those kinds of things. It helped them kind of weigh the benefits against the costs when, again, sometimes the benefits were external and tried to bring it in. These different market-based and non-market-based strategies are being applied today across at least 40 countries, 20 cities, states, provinces. I mean, it's happening. It's happening at other places. And I think kind of in a second, I'm going to talk about just two examples that have kind of been around for a while to kind of just help ground our discussion a little bit more. And then we're going to get into a full discussion of kind of the issues associated with these different approaches. So I do want to give time for that. But before we get into kind of the issues, does anybody want to add anything to my overview? Did I miss something big, or did you want to kind of help put it in a different light before we get to the next step?
I'm curious, this is Archie Hall. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I'm curious, the pretty much to see the value of how this is going to work is, I think Mr. Brown touched upon, and I think people kind of get that mixed up. He talked about cap and trade and regional cap and trade. And I was just curious to know, is there any other way that cap and trade can work in Louisiana other than regional?
So the example I'm about to give, I'm going to talk about one regional example, the Reggie, cooperative kind of in the Northeast, and then I'll talk about a state-specific example. California is running a state example of cap and trade, and so I'm just going to use those as examples, but the whole conversation, the first place I want to go, Archie, in the conversation is, does this make sense at a state level or only as a regional level or only as national policy? That was going to be one of my first salvos to the whole group. So if you could just kind of raise that again in a second, that'd be great. Does anybody else have any other thoughts on just kind of the overview, kind of the philosophy behind these systems?
Hey, Charles, just a small thing, although it has big implications. The description that says market is an efficient, flexible tool to cut emissions. Efficient is an important word there, but in economic terms, it doesn't deal with some of the challenges or distributional impacts of that efficiency, and that's where you get into equity issues and things like that. So I would just want to footnote that because I think it's an important part of the conversation. Not that there's anything wrong with your definition, but just that I want to make sure that that's a component of it as we go forward.
Yeah, we want to spend a lot of time on that in just a minute. Yeah, Stephen, do you have a comment too?
I was just going to say, as an economist, I'm also very comfortable adjusting that to acknowledge it can be an efficient, flexible tool. I think obviously any market has to be designed well. And so the rules of the game and the enforcement is particularly important.
Thank you. And Naveen?
Yeah, just wanted to mention, and I think it is kind of hiding in there. When we talk about the technologies in the market-based, there'll be agriculture in there where there is a point versus a non-point trading mechanism that is already existing or that can take place, I would say.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Anybody else before I kind of go into just two quick examples?
I just had one quick point, which
Eric,
is bear in mind that when we start talking about regional systems, that California has had some transactions with Canada, so you actually have an international option as well. The issue I worry about on regional programs is that the states are very, very different in their profiles, both in terms of usage as well as in emissions. And Louisiana sort of sets the bar in terms of CO2 emissions from industry, very different from California, which sets the bar for emissions from automobiles. There are a lot more automobiles than there are chemical plants. So I'm all in favor of trying to set some sort of standards. It's just that a standard for Louisiana is not necessarily going to be effective applied across 50 states. It's going to be very specific to Louisiana.
Correct.
Great. This is exactly what we want to talk about today. Thanks everybody for those comments. Just recognizing the differences. Just two quick examples. One is this regional greenhouse gas initiative called RGGI most of the time. It's the nation's first mandatory cap and trade program. It's an 11-state cooperative effort. Virginia, I think, is the newest. That's why it's in a slightly different color. And this one is focused on fossil fuel-fired electric power generators that have a capacity of 25 megawatts or higher. They're required to hold allowances for their carbon dioxide emissions, and then the emissions allowances are sold in auctions. They've raised about $3.2 billion as of 2019, and they've kind of distributed those funds to support energy efficiency, renewable energy, consumer assistance, and other climate-related efforts. So that's just one version. It's regional, but it's focused on certain types of emissions. In California, as Eric just kind of pointed out, it's a different situation. It's a single state, but they have been doing a few links to Quebec and the Western Climate Initiative. Their cap and trade system applies to about 85% of the state's emissions, so it's not focused on a single industry, but it's trying to be broader. Their emissions cap they set the decline rate of 3% between 2015 and 2020, and they're looking to lower it again by 5% between 2021 and 2030. And they too have a greenhouse gas reduction fund that is used to further the state's climate goals, and they've also have a set aside of 35% to environmentally disadvantaged and low-income communities. So it's just another example of how you can tailor this system to kind of meet different priorities and different needs, you know, as you see fit, if possible. So I'd love to kind of put it back on the group for a second now to kind of get you guys to kind of help lift up some of the ways that this conversation has been happening in the different sector committees already. So I know that this has been raised in a handful of groups. It's as everybody kind of mentioned in the introductions, it's one of the big policies that comes up a lot in this. So I just wondered if we could start by having somebody to volunteer to kind of characterize maybe the debate that happened in your sector committee. I'm not asking you to own it or to endorse it, but just to kind of try to give us a sense for how it was being discussed in some different contexts. I know it came up in the Ag and Forestry group. I think it came up in mining, oil and gas, and manufacturing as well, maybe transportation. So would anybody like to just kind of help put it into some different contexts for us to start off?
Charles, this is Archie. Real quick, can we make the distinction between a carbon tax and the cap and trade system?
Sure. So I think those are two market-based mechanisms that you know, have been deployed in different places. And so I mean, the tax, I mean, I think it can be structured differently, but you could do it to where you're actually assigning a cost to per you know, greenhouse gas emission or ton of CO2 emitted, versus the cap and trade where you're trying to create a maximum amount of emissions per year, and you're kind of ratcheting down that emissions ceiling to meet the goals that way. And then the costs are happening in terms of how you meet those new goals, whether you invest in cleaner systems or offsets in some cases, or you have to buy allowances from other cleaner sources. I don't know if that's helpful, or if anybody else can kind of provide a better distinction there. I do think we want to talk about both, Archie. I don't think we want to limit ourselves at this point in the discussion. And so it could be that the conversation, you know, the folks on the call might think that certain ideas are better than others. And I'm not here to have an opinion on which one is a better fit, but more to hear from the group about some of the pros and cons of each of them.
I think one of the things I'd mentioned, Charles, is that in my mind, I think about a carbon tax. You know, they can apply what, 40 or 50 bucks, you know, whatever the number is that people come up with to carbon, and it helps on the. I think it came under what you called the heading of social impact or something. But when you're evaluating investments in a company and for future, you can actually take that number and apply it to what essentially becomes your tax against that project, and you can look at alternatives or additional emission controls or appropriate other investments to offset that tax or reduce the potential tax on that project. Whereas cap and trade, you have this auction process. I think they hold, I don't know how many auctions California holds each year, but you know, I often think about it kind of like RINs, where my guess is that through cap and trade, depending on the amount of I don't even know what they call them, units that are available, you can purchase them, and those prices can go up and up and up some years or be relatively low other years. And depending on when you're making investments or when you need the emission trade, then you can get more severely impacted by the cost. But it is a good way, unlike carbon tax, I think, to continually ratchet down the overall emissions. Whereas carbon tax, I guess you do that by maybe ratcheting up the tax on carbon. I'd love to hear somebody who's more articulate or more familiar with each of these speak to that.
Well, the carbon tax, I think you place an amount per ton of emissions produced. And I think the cap and trade pretty much talk about what's allowable I think it places an amount that what's allowable each year.
Well, it gives you an allowable per either company or whatever, but then you can trade to have more if you're implementing a project, right? Okay.
Right. A system of
That's where the price gets set in the marketplace, as opposed to being set by whoever the taxing authority is. So that's one. The other is the cap and trade approach tries to take just direct advantage of the fact that the atmosphere doesn't care where the CO2 comes from. And so if you can reduce emissions to the climate by paying somebody else to do something, and they can reduce emissions more cheaply than you can, then you can get credit for those reductions in a cap and trade program. The atmosphere is held harmless because the atmosphere is getting the reductions that you're going for based on the cap, but you find the most efficient, cheapest way to do it. I mean, that's the sort of essence of the cap and trade program. A tax tries to guess at that efficiency, what's the right price to drive those, and doesn't generally, you're not allowed to trade out of that. You need to make those reductions or you need to change your processes, right? I mean, that's it. Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of the basic difference. One other difference that I would call out is that with a tax, you're guessing at what the emission reductions might be. You don't know because you don't have a cap. If you have a cap, that's what the emission reductions are supposed to be. You know what the goal is, you know what you're measuring, and you know whether you hit your goal or not. With the tax, you're guessing what it'll cost to get people to do the things that you want them to do, but you don't know until you see how that goes, right? So that's
I guess which kind of takes me back to my original question. How do a cap and trade work, other than regional? Because you can't control the air or the atmosphere. So I guess that's something we're gonna have to figure out. Because I know somebody mentioned something about a state cap and trade, but I was just curious to know if Mr. Brown knew a little bit more about how does that work? How would that work?
And let me say this, it really can't work unless it's sort of modeling what Reggie did. And I'm thinking not 11 states, but I'm thinking 4 or 5 states, southern states that have the same coastlines and share the same airsheds. So that's what I've sort of charged all the folks to look at. Once we've figured out how we want to manage it in Louisiana, and there will be a cap. There's going to be a tonnage limit where we are right now. That's going to be the number. If you want to permit an expansion or a new facility that's going to emit 2 million tons of CO2, then you got to find some other entity within the state or within the region to reduce their emissions by 2 million tons, or they've undertaken some project that they built up credits. And as you said, the market determines how much those credits can be bought and sold for, but we never go above where we are right now. I will also say for this group, we are actually in an extremely good position in that however we decide to move forward with our cap, there's going to be some coal-fired units that produces electricity that over the next 4 or 5 years will come offline. And so we're going to see major reductions right there. And we may look at building in an automatic reduction in our cap based on those numbers. So that's sort of where we are. I think we've got to have a reasonable approach. We're going to work out how we do it here in LA. Then we move to Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, and probably Oklahoma. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. And then I see Karen's hand and Naveen's hand. And then I'm hoping somebody can also throw out a couple more examples maybe from their committee before I throw up all the questions for today. Karen?
A couple things I wanted to clarify. One, and maybe I should have asked this at the last slide, I apologize, but I'm unsure why the social cost of carbon is in a separate bucket from carbon trading or carbon pricing, why it would not be possible to think about a carbon price as reflecting the social cost of carbon. And just South Africa is an example of a country that has imposed a carbon tax, and the price is set to reflect the social cost of carbon. So that's just one policy design choice I was curious about and wanted to flag. Second, I think an important thing in thinking about the policy design choices available for cap and trade, although often offsets are a part of that, they don't have to be. And I defer to the economists on this, but depending on how the offsets are designed, that can lead to a lot of, at best, inefficiencies and at worst, complete failures to actually meet your reduction goals. So I just wanted to flag those 2 points.
Those are great. Those are great. And Naveen?
Yeah, I want to speak about the discussions that happen in our subcommittee regarding the carbon practices. So the discussion can fall anywhere into the carbon tax or exchange or cap and trade. So what we were talking about is how a point source and industry can help a farmer install and maintain a practice that would sequester carbon. Now, the discussion always comes on the point source side. What is the baseline cost for a carbon unit? And that's where our discussion can help lead. Is the minimum price to install and maintain a practice is always treated as a baseline. And then the market can decide and define where that price is and where the point source is willing to pay a non-point source to maintain that practice. So however, what happens is, who is responsible for verifying those practices and how much amount of carbon is stored and how long those practices have to be in place? That is an area that is still lacking and doesn't have a strong set of data to present. You can fall back on the Midwest for some of the data, but the land in different states is different. Even though carbon is a global pollutant, the amount of carbon a land sequesters is different the way the land is formed in every state. So we want to keep that in mind. But talking from a carbon exchange or carbon tax perspective, the minimum price that a farmer has to incur to put any practice can be treated as a baseline price, and the market would define, which would then overcome a market failure situation. That's the discussion. Ron, do you want to add anything else from our committee meetings?
Naveed, yeah, I agree that our group really hasn't looked at a carbon tax or cap and trade. We're kind of looking at agriculture as a significant sequester of carbon, and how agriculture can play a role in helping industries that may be having a difficulty with meeting their carbon requirement as far as what their emissions are. And I think, from that perspective, agriculture has a significant place at the table when we start talking about cap and trade in particular. As far as a carbon tax is concerned, I really haven't thought much about how that would impact what agriculture can do.
Right, and I'll quickly add, agriculture, when it applies these nitrogen fertilizers, we do have what is called as a life cycle analysis. We treat everything that is going into agriculture in carbon units using a life cycle analogy. And the life cycle analysis converts everything that is going into a farm into carbon equivalents, which is then being traded. Because for fertilizer production itself, there is carbon that is going into its production as well. So that's how our discussions in our committee has been going. And I think if anyone has any questions, we'll be happy to clarify and answer.
That's great. Eric, I see your hand, and then maybe we could get somebody else from the manufacturing side conversation to go next. And then maybe Hunter. Yeah, thank you.
Well, my point was very short, which is that agriculture is certainly a large carbon sink, but the fact of the matter is most of the carbon that's produced in producing ammonia is going into the air. And that ammonia, over 95% of it's going into fertilizer. So really, agriculture is on both sides of that particular fence. That was my only point.
Thanks. Hunter, did you have a point?
Yeah, on the manufacturing subcommittee, at least to my knowledge, we really didn't debate the relative merits of any of these proposals. Rather, we discussed how carbon proposals or pricing proposals or different policy initiatives can affect incentivizing low carbon investment so that products that are made from lower carbon intensity products can be valued in a way so that the market can send a signal. And I would point out out of the four, I mean, they're all kind of related to each other. You know, the low carbon fuel standard in California provides such an incentive to projects. There are projects in Louisiana that are working today to produce products that are compliant with the California low carbon fuel standard. And there's actually a cap and trade mechanism embedded in the low carbon fuel standard in California. So I think part of this exercise, we should think about what it is that we're intending to accomplish. Are we just trying to lower emissions, or are we trying to create investment in Louisiana that's going to produce better economics for project developers and businesses that are trying to capture CO2 and sequester it and that kind of thing?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So I think we've already been touching on a lot of these. I'm just putting up this slide. We just kind of, our team kind of came up with some big, just buckets of issues that might be ripe for discussion as we talk about this topic. So I'm just going to just briefly name them, and then we can see if there's more things to add to it. I think one is this jurisdictional boundary, whether that's applicable or not at all. So we heard Secretary Brown talk about a multi-state situation. We've talked about other, just other approaches, international, national. There's also, as we've seen, some states or some of these choose to focus on a particular type of emission or a particular sector. But these are all policy choices that can be addressed, that can be taken up. There are a lot of implementation hurdles, as we were talking about, setting up auctions and setting bars and identifying the right price for certain mechanisms, and plus all the reporting and verifying and monitoring that would need to go along with that, as well as some others that have already been raised here. There are equity concerns with how these actually work in real life. If we're increasing the cost of energy and materials for consumers, it's going to hurt low-income people more, than higher income folks. There can be concerns with the ability of cap and trade. Somebody mentioned offsets. So these market failures that are hurting certain communities more than others. There are also just there's just big questions of the allocation of any kind of proceeds or revenues. If we were to generate revenue through this, can we offset some of these concerns? Can they go towards other priorities? And then finally, are markets the wrong way to think about this entirely, and are they just not a flawed approach? And I just wanted to leave space for folks that wanted to take that opinion or kind of talk more about that angle. So I think it would be great if we could kind of spend a little more time maybe on the first couple, just again on Secretary Brown and some other folks who were kind of talking about the scope and scale of this in Louisiana. So maybe we can spend a minute on just the pros and cons of the state kind of taking the lead on this, and then kind of where it makes sense to maybe apply it. Are we thinking about economy-wide, or are we thinking about a specific sector? But I'm going to turn it over to Glenn first, because I appreciate the hands. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. So let me just say, as far as the jurisdictional aspect goes, the broader scope you have for your carbon pricing system, the more efficient it's going to be. So that's both applies, I think, geographically, as well as how many sectors of the economy are you including. So climate change is a global issue. It's not a Louisiana specific issue. So, the more you can tie into that, that's better as well. Our preference is certainly to see a national carbon price. We'd love to see the state use its leverage in Washington, D.C. to promote that concept. If you can't get a national carbon tax or a national carbon price system, then something regional like a RGGI, where again, you're bringing a broader geography into it, makes more sense. And then if you can't get that, well, then I guess you're looking at a state-specific option. So that's speaking to the geographic boundaries of it. Then when you talk about the industry sectors, again, the wider net you cast, the greater the opportunity is for the market to find the lowest cost solutions. And at the end of the day, I mean, everybody wins in that scenario.
Thanks. Nathan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just echo some of what Glenn was saying around the application to the economy wide. Yeah, you want to cast the widest net. If you truly want to develop a market, you want to get as many folks involved as possible. But taking a step back to the jurisdictional boundary question, I mean, we're working internally to figure out, I guess, exactly where our folks really lie on this issue. But I will say that some things to consider when you're talking about a state-based system would be how that's going to impact, I guess, competitiveness from a business perspective with neighboring states, say Texas. And then also leads into the regional conversation of if you don't have all the critical players in the region on board, then you're really not going to drive the, I guess, the reductions that you want, because we run the risk of basically just pushing the industrial activity across the border to the neighboring state, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
You use the term competitiveness. I think that's going to, that's already driving the marketplace when it comes to decarbonization, because I mean, most of the companies from a competitive standpoint wants to be much more attractive to investors and, have be a preferred company by the customers, as well as increasing their brand. So I think those are going to be driven. And I think that can be used also in getting them motivated behind the market.
Great. Stacy and then Eric.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple comments with regard to LCFS in this area. One thing that I think we should be aware of is, and maybe everybody is that, California was truly addressing its transportation fuels and emissions issues and smog, et cetera, in their large cities when they put in LCFS. I was involved in the calculations, just running some what ifs back in 2000, I guess 4, 5, that time frame. And it was very interesting to see what happened as a result of that. And that is that fewer refineries make the California gasoline. And so they are a very large state, and they can supply a lot of what they need with their internal refining capacity, but they are so perfectly balanced that if any of their refineries go down, the ability to supply from other states is very, very difficult. I ran the Deer Park refinery here in Houston, and when they needed gasoline in California, the prices just screamed upward, made it very attractive for us to think about getting gasoline there. But the flavor of the gasoline, as I call it, there's well over 100 flavors of gasoline already in this country. Various times of the year, to create the California gasoline was just too difficult. So I think that is a consideration if you're looking at the situation in Louisiana, to actually ask ourselves, where's the biggest issues, how the carbon emissions break down. And if it's about fixed facilities, large industrial sites, power facilities, and the transportation aspects are much less, I would steer away from LCFS, because you can create a lot of other challenges. And I think it also will become a tax on, regressive tax, I guess you'd call it.
Thanks, Stacy. Eric, did you have another comment too?
I did have a comment. The first one is that the other thing to remember is that cap and trade systems work. Actually, I would disagree with some of the earlier statements. They work best when there are fewer players. The first one that comes to mind, and Stacy may not remember this one, but when we were talking about tetraethyl lead, there were only 3 manufacturers in the world, and there were only, at least in the US, about 100 customers. So it would make sense in that case because you could smooth out the impact between the people who were making major revisions in a refinery. They could cover the people that were not, and then when they got finished, the guy that and they could transfer that credit. Then when they got finished, the next guy would get in and he'd build his new cat cracker or whatever it was, or his alkylation unit, whatever the equipment was, so that his capital costs could carry the load for the whole industry. When you get into something like carbon that is so all pervasive, you got so many players, just simply the enforcement issues become major. The other thing that we've already seen is that if you are enforcing your rules and somebody else isn't, there's going to be a sort of the equivalent of white flight. You're going to see people leaving to go to the lower cost regime. And you've already seen some of that with our attempts to export LNG to France, and France coming back and saying, well, we don't really believe you're doing enough to reduce the CO2 comment. That's basically a tax it's a tariff on imports. And that's the sort of thing you want to avoid, whether it's between states or it's between nations. And again, enforcement becomes a major concern if you're enforcing the rules and somebody else isn't. That's all I had.
Thank you. Hunter, I see your hand, and then I think I'd like to switch gears just after Hunter, just for a little bit to kind of talk about the kind of the flip side, some of the equity concerns and some of the inadequacies of kind of doing this at all for a little bit, and then we can kind of come back to some of the specifics again if we're there. But Hunter, please go next.
Sure. It's very interesting conversation. What last couple of comments seem to be sort of related to fears of that Louisiana could put itself into a competitive poor position, either of going it alone or going too small, and if other states aren't doing the same thing, and I think that we ought to recognize that the federal government is maybe closer to a carbon tax than or a national cap and trade system, maybe closer politically than Louisiana is by itself. And so that political reality is probably something to think about. But I will say that there is big dividends to pursuing a pathways-based approach, a carbon intensity pathways-based approach like the low carbon fuel standard, because at least that way, as Louisiana invests in lower carbon pathways, whether you're manufacturing LNG or methanol or ammonia or hydrogen, then as you make those investments, how much less carbon intensive your products are going to be. And those lower carbon products, such as what Professor Smith just mentioned about export of LNG to Europe, those lower carbon intensity, that lower carbon intensity LNG is going to have a premium on the market and is going to be valued in the market. And so, whether you actually impose the tax or not, creating a system where you can measure carbon intensity could be very valuable by itself.
This is Steve. If I could just add to what Hunter said, that it is a huge issue. It's been managed in a lot of places, but the ability to measure accurately and have a system that is accepted in the marketplace as doing so really critical, because otherwise you do get what Professor Smith referred to as somebody being able to suggest, and that's all they kind of have to do, that your system isn't valid, and then you've got the marketplace trying to figure it out. But that does create the dilemma associated with an economy-wide or multi-sector approach, is that in order for that to work, everybody has to have a system of measuring what it is that they do and what the carbon impacts are. So and for us in Louisiana, that's particularly important relative to agriculture or to the wetlands or the things that we would love to be able to see more carbon sequestered in, but we have to be able to measure it and capture it, and the marketplace has to believe it in order for that to have the value that we would want it to have. So that measurement and that validation is just a critical component, and there's a tendency for folks who want to get to a cap and trade system to kind of move past that, and it never works because the marketplace just goes, nah, nice try, sorry, can't do it. That's the thing.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, are there enough examples out there? I know there are lots of examples out there, but is there a playbook that's fairly well accepted that we could take on? I heard Secretary Brown say he's got people working on getting there on some of these issues. Is this group aware, I guess, of just kind of ways to kind of build that reliability and verification into it?
Well, perhaps the best verification we've got right now, I hesitate to say it, but is the EPA flight system, which provides emissions data for CO2, nitrous oxides, and a few other things for each plant, and actually down to each unit within each plant, so that whether we're talking about a Shell refinery or we're talking about a CF Industries ammonia plant, they have multi-year data available to give you how much CO2 was emitted year to year for that plant. Now, whether it's this is data that's provided by the companies based on guidelines, but whether that's an enforceable measurement device or not, I don't know. It's just the best that we've got right now.
Well, the most mature systems that are out there are in Europe, because they've bitten some of these bullets earlier than we have, in terms of trying to look cross-sectoral. California is next there in terms of its experience. Reggie is, as has been discussed, a single sector focus, though there is an effort to try to build transportation in there in this process. So that's sort of the tiering of where the experience is, and that means looking at each of those systems and seeing what is applicable and what is not. There's a complexity to the European system based on lots of things that may not make it, and I'm not sure Louisiana legislature is ready to adapt a European approach to anything. So there's that. But
I would make the point, I was dealing with some people in South Korea about LNG imports from Louisiana, and received the question point blank, what are you doing to reduce CO2 emissions from your LNG exports? Now, they didn't mean taking the carbon out of the LNG, but they were definitely talking about taking the carbon out of the processes used to make the LNG. And they were telling me what the Middle Easterners were doing and what I think other countries were doing to reduce their CO2 net emissions from LNG manufacture. And there are some things we can do. I don't think we're doing them right now, but I think there are things that the state could, as a big exporter of LNG, could do to try and establish a standard bar for LNG emissions or CO2 emissions from LNG manufacture, and enforce that across, because we don't have that many manufacturers. Again, it's a small group of players, and it would be relatively easy to enforce.
I think that's a really good point. And Steve, I'd be curious in your thoughts on this, is that once I find that in the beginning, anything that we try to do, we're not very good at. So when we first say we have to estimate our CO2 emissions and we have to enter that into a federal register, we usually have to use some sort of guesstimates that per piece of equipment, or if we're out in the upstream, maybe an estimate around a venting amount of gas. And when you start there, you have all these estimates, and then you say to yourself, now I got to reduce it. Then you start actually saying, well, how can I measure it better? And we get smarter and smarter, start applying innovative technology. But unless you're forced to actually measure it and then start reducing it, there's no real incentive to get your measurement right. Do you have thoughts on that, on how maybe some of these systems could drive improvements and innovation in that area? Because measurement is key and where it all begins.
I mean, for me, my experience is that it's a combination of the two things. Hunter talked about the incentives in the marketplace to encourage, from a pure financial perspective, investment in the direction that you want to see investment go in. And so being connected into markets that allow you that sort of take advantage of that is one. The other is, and this is, we live in a different time. I grew up when the U.S. Senate would, in fact, say to the car companies, for example, who were saying they were going to go bankrupt if they had to cut emissions by 50% in 5 years, which is what the Clean Air Act said they were going to have to do. And the Senate said, well, we don't really think that's going to happen. And so we're going to go ahead and put this standard in place. And let's see how you do. And we're fully confident that if you're really going to have this kind of economic problem, you're going to be back in front of us telling us what you need. So we're going to stick with this for now. And of course, in that case, the catalytic converter came online and was able to be integrated into the manufacturing in about 2.5 years. So part of it is technology forcing, and I know how much my friends in industry hate that term. And like I said, it's a different time, but it's the two things: building incentives, and to the extent that you have to have some market forcing in there, and we probably will have to do there. Then people take, as you know as well as anybody on this call, people take it seriously, and that's the combination I think you have to do. So,
thank you. Great point.
Hunter, did you have a thought there? And then I do want to make sure we put some time on some of the concerns associated with these policies in general, particularly the equity concerns and some of the other just kind of general market failures that maybe it's not a good way to address some of the problems that are associated with this issue.
Sure.
But Hunter, please,
yeah. I just wanted to add, just to be, so I could be a little bit more clear in following up on what Steve and Professor Smith and others mentioned. So, the California low carbon fuel standard is a pathways approach. And so what I mean by that is that the state establishes carbon intensity scores, baseline scores for each transportation fuel that's marketed in the state. And so that's all based on on life cycle analysis, like from well to pump type of, on an energy density basis. So those are known, and they're established by year. And of course, it's a compliance program, so they lower the carbon intensity that players have, that manufacturers have to meet every year. And so new product that's coming into the market that is less carbon intensive can compare that carbon intensity score with the baseline score. What I'm suggesting is if it's too far of a reach to actually implement something from a pricing mechanism in Louisiana today, perhaps we could get there by at least implementing a carbon intensity measurement program, so that those LNG exporters, they're taking gas from the Haynesville. If it's lower CO2, then they can measure it. And then the buyer in Europe or Korea, or wherever that buyer is going to be able to see for itself what the difference is in carbon intensity, and they can make an informed, rational decision about whether that deserves a premium of whatever sort in the market. So I just want to be a little bit more clear about that.
And that would have value whether or not they're there was a federal policy that came in after the fact, right? I mean, that would allow
Sure.
for, yeah.
Sure, because the value is companies and consumers, governments are valuing lower carbon intensity products already for compliance for ESG purposes or for compliance purposes somewhere else. So what we would be doing is making Louisiana products that are less carbon intensive, competitive on the market. And what I mean by premium could be an actual price premium, but it could also be, it's a commodities markets. You always want to be the first sold in a market. You don't want to be the last sold, because the last sold may not get sold in a market. So that the lower carbon intensity product should be something that's valued from that perspective as well.
Great. Naveen.
Yeah, I mean, a very similar concept already exists in ag that Hunter mentioned. I mean, where some of the industries like Kellogg's have contracts with our rice farmers because they grow it sustainably. They get a price premium. So the framework is already there to at least take a look and see how those industries are doing that kind of mechanism and that kind of market system, and see if that would be any useful.
Fascinating. That's great. Okay, so I did a very short, did not do it justice, explanation of just some of the potential equity concerns that it might be associated with these kinds of carbon pricing mechanisms. Would anybody like to take a stab at fleshing those out a little bit more, or kind of highlighting some of those types of issues that might really be important to consider as we're just thinking through this policy all the way through? And I'll just see if anybody has a thought to start us off with. And oh, I see two hands. Thank you, Karen and Glenn. Thank you. Appreciate y'all getting this going.
So I just wanted to follow up on Steve had mentioned the equity concerns, in particular the cap and trade mechanism is a big danger with that, and because in terms of carbon, what's being traded, that it doesn't have local impacts. It goes up and mixes with everybody else's, and it has local impacts. The climate crisis impacts differently. But in one of the big benefits of decreasing emissions is that from fossil fuels is that you also decrease NOx, particulate matter, all of these other deadly pollutants that communities suffer from disproportionately. And if there's not accompanying regulatory mechanisms to make sure that that's not lost in the mix, if the idea is that we're just considering going to the market to take care of this problem rather than assuring that it's the whole part of suite of policy mechanisms that are government driven towards decreasing production, which is what we need to do, we really risk just perpetuating the same problems and indeed exacerbating them. Because the worst polluters are going to have the incentives to buy offsets and things like that, rather than actually decreasing emissions. So I think the local pollutants concern, NOx, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, is a huge concern, and in fact was a huge failure in terms of California's cap and trade mechanism.
Thank you, Karen. And Glenn, did you have something else too to add?
Yeah, so I think you did a great job of capturing the problem with equity, the fact that lower income people spend disproportionately more of their income on energy, and therefore any additional tax on energy is going to be more impactful on them. ExxonMobil, and I think BHP is on the call as well. I think BHP is also a member of the Climate Leadership Council. Their proposal, while talking on a federal level, is a carbon tax. They call it a carbon dividend policy because you take the proceeds from the tax, and I believe it's a $2,000 dividend to every household, which ends up being actually disproportionately more money in the hands of low-income people, and that's a way of addressing it. It's part of the, I guess, the beauty of a pricing system is that it creates a pool of funds for redistribution.
Thanks, Glenn. Steve?
Yeah, as people come on and off, your little square moves, and then you have to chase it around to be able to unmute.
That'd be crazy too.
So there's really a long list of equity concerns, which began with community engagement and involvement in decision making for their communities, because decisions about facilities and communities affect the communities. To adequate monitoring to be in place to know whether or not any trading of carbon ends up in increasing emissions from other pollutants of concern to communities. To more broadly economic concerns, one with pricing, let's say utility costs go up, that disproportionately impacts people on the lower scales. To job losses as energy, particularly in a place like Louisiana, where most likely we're going to see more and more shift towards low carbon intensity, cleaner industries. And if we're unable to make those adjustments ourselves, we're likely to see disproportionate job losses. A lot of people in the communities that are affected by air pollution are also people who work at those plants. And if they lose jobs, then there's some significant levels of concern that kind of go across the board in thinking about how we actually do this. And the key, which was not the key in the past for the most part, the most aggressive conversation about this occurred in California when California moved forward with its cap and trade program, because the argument that people made, including EDF where I worked, was that when local people in the community said, hey, we're going to get more pollution in our community, or at least the pollution that should be being reduced because people are reducing carbon isn't going to be reduced because they'll just buy their way out of it by paying somebody else to reduce it, and so we'll continue to be polluted. And in many cases, they would argue that was going to be above the air pollution standards for the other toxics and things in the community. And we boldly said, well, that's what the Clean Air Act is for, is to make sure that those toxics don't go up, that all of those things are kept under their legal limits. And in fact, that's exactly what the law is for. And they just laughed at us and said, you obviously don't live where we live, because we don't know what's in our communities. We don't have enough monitoring to know whether that's occurring. And we have no faith in the regulatory system to actually accomplish that you said you put in the law. And that's a very tough place to be, but that's how the conversation's going to go. It's absolutely going to be based on lack of faith in these systems. And the only way I know to try to approach that is to bring people in on the front end who are going to be impacted, who live in these communities, so they can participate in helping shape these systems, if you can do that, rather than be handed another decision which they're not going to have faith in. That's a social component more than a technical component, but it is very real, and it's very much a part of gaining social acceptance to these market-based approaches. There is some serious thinking going on in the community of actors like people at EDF who really believe in the marketplace, really trying to figure out, so how do we change what we've been trying to do so that it in fact actually includes equity now and makes it deal with these issues rather than what the system did before, which was not. So but my advice here is to try to figure out now, if we're going to go down this path, how to make sure that people are at the table in these conversations who need to be, so that they can represent themselves and their concerns. If we can't do that, we're going down the same road we've always gone down, which is to say, we're smarter than you are, we're going to do this, and that's the way it is. So that's the end of my speech. Sorry about that, but it's pretty fundamental if you're going to deal with all these other details, which are important, but which we have a tendency to decide ourselves rather than have the people who are really directly affected making decisions. So.
Thanks, Steve. I'm gonna let Steven try to follow that. He had a hand up.
Well, I'll be brief. I think some really good perspective, and I think what I wanted to offer is, as we talk about this, I think it's important to preface the discussion of equity concerns. And before I say this, I want to emphasize I do think it's important that we're looking at this and tracking this as we think about how we might implement a policy, what things we need to bring alongside that to make sure that a policy is not making equity issues worse. But I think it's important that we preface the whole discussion, and perhaps even to Steve's point about community engagement, that we're doing enough to ensure that there's broad information about the current state of the world, which is that low income and minority communities are currently the most vulnerable in terms of risks related to climate change, flood risks, and storm related risks along the coast. So I think that's just an important sort of piece of backdrop. And as we think about future risks, without interventions and policies to help reduce those risks, these are the very communities that are likely to be most severely impacted. So when we think about a potential policy, if it if some of those costs are disproportionate, we should address it. But the backdrop here is one where those very communities may also benefit the most from that type of policy.
Charles, you've been kind of quiet. Charles Allen, do you have anything to kind of add to this as we're kind of in this space?
Just to stress the point from our dear friend and colleague, Steve Cochran, that it absolutely makes sense that the people who are on the front line of receiving the benefits or the losses, additional losses, must be engaged early. They can't tell their story better than themselves, basically. This is all still very interesting to me, and I'm really curious to hear more from those who I consider to be more of experts in this topic as to what they see we may need to offer, to really remedy whatever losses or whatever, just to see what else we may need to remedy, this situation here.
And maybe part of that, I know not all of that, but maybe part of that is in terms of maybe what Steven said and what kind of Glenn was kind of bringing up, ways to kind of just bring things along with these policies to kind of help give back to to kind of address some of the concerns that we know will come up. So whether that's about a dividend that somebody brought up, or are there, so I've got this short category of just kind of how some of these revenues or proceeds, whatever you want to call them, are kind of given back to support different priorities. Is that a space that people think is fruitful to talk about ways to kind of pair carbon pricing with kind of some other policies, or is that kind of not enough? Maybe that's a good place to go. If that's I don't know, Charles, is that kind of what you meant, or you had bigger things in mind?
That's along the lines of what I meant. Yeah.
Okay.
I would make one point, which is that we haven't talked about 45Q because that's not a pricing issue, but 45Q is an initiative program designed to pay people to or increase their likelihood of sequestering carbon, or at least putting carbon into long-term stable products. And I think there is some room within Louisiana to do that. In fact, I would suggest that maybe Louisiana wants to think about something roughly parallel to what California has done in terms of providing incentives rather than a tax. How you pay for that tax, of course, is an issue, but how you pay for the incentive is an issue. But 45Q is a well-designed structure that the federal government has put forth, and people here in Louisiana are making investments today based upon it. And I would suspect they would make bigger investments if there was a state companion incentive program to go along with it. That's really not a carbon tax or a cap and trade, but it's an incentive program that certainly would get the attention of many of the companies that do have options in terms of trying to invest money to reduce their carbon emissions.
Karen, Secretary Brown and then Karen. I haven't heard from you guys. So Secretary Brown, can you go next, and then Karen, and then Steve?
Yes, I just wanted to kind of comment and just, first of all, tell everybody that everything that's been said so far is very interesting. I did bring up the idea of how do you cite, what kind of criteria do you use to cite any type of facilities? And the talk about job creation, green jobs, and some of the questions and some of the gaps that are still need to be filled is exactly how that impacts and translates into what we do in Louisiana. I mean, are we going to stop working at fossil fuel facilities and all of a sudden start making windmill blades? So that's been discussed on another path. Also, when it comes to if we did some type of cap and trade and created some type of fund, I absolutely think that that's probably the route that we need to go. Also, from an economic standpoint, if you do raise the cost of energy, it is going to disproportionately impact low income and minority communities. So all those things that have been said is exactly accurate. Bringing folks to the table early is something that needs to happen, but it needs to be done in a systematic way that's productive. I've had solar farms in certain parts of the state that nobody wants because of the way they look. So it is a challenge, and me being a regulator and the folks that issue permits, we have to deal with it on a constant basis. So I just wanted to throw those few things out there to say that everything everybody said is accurate. I do think we need to probably have some type of fund that's developed that we can put money back into communities and then allow them the opportunity to catch up. So just wanted to add that, Charles.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Brown. If I could just ask one more follow-up question. There was a lot of talk about monitoring, whether that was to kind of help verify for market purposes or verify for the communities that live there that things are actually happening. Did that strike you as something possible or a difficulty, or do you have any thoughts on that?
So every time we talk about air quality, I always make the statement that EPA's criteria pollutants are not necessarily hazardous pollutants, but they deal with respiratory issues and sometimes with long-term health issues. But Louisiana is an attainment for every criteria pollutant as we talk, except for sulfur dioxide in 2 small areas of the state. And as soon as the consent decrees have been settled, we'll be in full attainment. There's not many other states that can stand up and say what I just said. Now, having said that, we're always looking for ways to improve air quality. We have a robust air monitoring network. We also have a very robust local community monitoring network. Can we use more? Can we utilize more? Of course. And as I look to get more federal funding, I'm going to increase that network. But every community is concerned about their air quality, but can I have a monitor in every community and every municipality in the state? And that's not feasible. But we do have a robust network that's real time right now. You can pull it up and see what the air quality is at 43 different sites throughout the state, mostly concentrated south of Alexandria, based on what the industry is. But we can always use more air monitoring. And when you talk about monitoring, CO2 is not a regulated pollutant. And so we're going to be creating a whole new regulatory scheme that EPA hadn't even undertaken yet. So I also wanted folks to know that that's where we're headed too. So we can talk about cap and trade, and that's why industry has to be a part of whatever we do, because right now that regulatory scheme is going to directly impact them. But right now there is no scheme in place. Okay, Charles?
Thank you, Secretary Brown. Karen, you had a hand?
Yeah, thanks. So I was just going to mention Eric's point about the subsidy for sequestration. That is I think that just highlights the importance to consider any sort of, whether it's a trading mechanism or a pricing mechanism, in light of the other policy that's in place. That it's not an either or, and it can't be an either or between it being a market-based approach versus a strong governmental approach that's designed to ramp down production fast enough to shift us from fossil fuel energy systems to renewable, which is what we know we need to do. And a market-based approach alone won't get us there. So another thing to think about are how our renewable industries getting empowered as a result of market-based approaches, whether it's through subsidies, as well as other strong governmental regulations in place. And my concern, although I applaud the CLC for advocating climate policy at the federal level, is that what they have proposed in Congress is a price on carbon on the condition that there's very, very weak other regulation. And I think that that's a false choice and one that will get us nowhere in terms of addressing the climate crisis. So although this certainly has to be interrogated on its own in terms of the mechanism, how the mechanism would work for Louisiana or at the regional level or the global level can't be considered in a vacuum. We really need to think about the suite of other policy options, whether it's subsidies to renewables and other measures, as well as strong regulation of local pollutants, criteria pollutants. All of that has to be part of it. So I think it's important not to consider this as in isolation, because it risks it being an alternative to strong governmental intervention.
Thank you, Karen. Steve, are you unmuted to talk? Yeah.
Generally am. I've been talking a lot, so I don't want to continue doing that. If I don't know where we're going next, so I can certainly pause for now and then.
I think I say jump in if you don't mind, and unless somebody else wants to raise a hand.
Well, a couple of things. One, to your question about the allocation of proceeds and revenues from a market-based system, I do think this list, and there are probably some others, is the right way to think about that. How do you it gets to some degree, can get to what Karen is talking about. How can you use some of that money to subsidize where necessary the movement towards new energy technologies? Can you help offset costs associated with energy price changes? If that's not, I mean, there are lots of opportunities there to try to make it some. There's a political question about whether you do it through a dividend process where people can do that for themselves, or whether you allocate some of that from the government's perspective. If I had to guess, I'd say we'll probably end up doing both at the federal level if we ever actually get to that stage. But that's the sort of trade-off. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the subsidy that Dr. Smith and Karen talked about for carbon sequestration or carbon capture and storage, actually. If you remember, those of you who watched the presentation that came from Princeton, sort of their generalized preferred option had a very significant level of carbon capture and storage, and a very significant level of storage in and around Louisiana. Sort of for the Gulf Coast, that's about 75% of carbon capture across the country would be in that scenario, stored either in southern Louisiana or Texas, a little bit in Mississippi. That has fairly strong implications for pipelines, for location, if facilities, Louisiana has 2/3 of its emissions that come from industrial facilities. If they're going to capture carbon, they may need to put in facilities to be able to do that. They may need to expand footprint. And then you've got in southern Louisiana challenges with siting relative to wetlands and things like that. Those are a number of questions which it strikes me haven't really been addressed in the sort of what feels like a fairly rapid rush towards full-scale carbon capture and storage in Louisiana. And I think it's something that the community of people who are focusing on this question need to really begin to take up. It will definitely be, again, back to communities, significant questions from communities about what is going to happen in their communities, whether it's increased pipelines or expansion of footprints or things like that. But it looms as something that has such potential significance for Louisiana, both for the makeup of the industry here and for what comes in from out of state, that it does seem to me that we really do need to focus clearly on what the implications of moving aggressively in that direction are. So since it came up, I wanted to go ahead and address it in this setting with people who are thinking about this stuff.
Okay. Is there anybody we haven't heard from that wants to kind of chime in on something? I don't know, Mark Davis, are there any legal issues that you feel like haven't been raised or could come in, or anyone else that's kind of not had a chance to talk yet?
Yeah, Charles, this is Mark. I mean, obviously, I mean, like Steve was just mentioning, that some of the things we'll be talking about, involve activities in wetlands. You're going to have zoning issues. You're going to have issues affecting property rights. But for the most part, I think we should be trying to figure out what we really want to do, and then take a look at the legal architecture. I mean, we didn't, what we now think of as our coastal restoration program, there was no legal framework for that in 1988. So we created one, but we had to know what we were trying to create. So I think the approach that I've been listening to today gives me some confidence that we actually are on the right path. I mean, I think anytime you are talking about like market drivers, I think we have to be aware that what are the ones that are actually going to make a difference. And for the most part, good things don't happen just because you want them to. It's because, I think as Steve Barnes mentioned earlier, is there have to be enforcement mechanisms, and those can be legal, or those can be market driven. But for the most part, I think that we should continue on the course we're on and not let law get ahead of our planning for a destination. Law is going to matter a whole lot here, but also it's not just Louisiana law, and it's not just U.S. law that we're going to be ultimately having to take a look at. So as much as I like to talk and talk and talk and talk, this is one of those conversations I'm benefiting a whole lot more from by listening.
Thanks, Mark. Well, this group is kind of slowing down a little bit. I would like to kind of hone back in on some of the actions that are kind of being developed, or maybe there's a gap. Maybe we could just talk for a minute about how to kind of push something forward that can be brought into this climate planning process that we're all a part of. It sounded like Secretary Brown was kind of working on something related, in this space. Is there anything else that's happening that maybe that you're aware of from your other committees that we want to kind of make sure we're thinking about, or are there specific ways we can kind of improve actions or design new things that can kind of be brought into our approach today?
Hi, everyone. This is Lindsay. Hunter, I believe you've mentioned in this meeting and then in the manufacturing and industry group that you were working on a carbon tax idea. I know Takesha was also working on that, so possibly Hunter, Greg, Bowser, and I can coordinate with Takesha on developing that if that is still of interest. And Dr. Brown, I think it might be helpful for us to consider some of the different lenses that have been helpful here. So for example, understanding the legal framework that might be necessary. Some of these great equity experts that we have on this group that have raised really good equity concerns that need to be part of the consideration could also be helpful in thinking through what that cap and trade program might look like. I know there was some contention around this jurisdictional boundary question as well, whether it's better suited as state-based or a regional-based approach. And so maybe those conversations can also continue moving forward. Eric, I believe that was you who raised that as a concern and that it was better to focus on the state side. And then Dr. Brown and Hunter possibly raising that maybe a regional approach would be better towards that. And then another interesting topic that was brought up is the carbon intensity measurement program. I thought that was a great idea that Hunter offered as well. And Hunter, I don't mean to put you on the spot with a few different ideas, but I do think this is a really great group to bring together because we have equity, financial, and legal experts all at the table thinking about this, which, as we can see even on the slide, there are a lot of issues from each of these advisory areas that should be considered as we're developing out these policies. So with that, I'll open it up if anyone has ideas or would like to carry some of these actions forward.
I think there's one other point that we haven't talked about, but in large part, this is an energy state. And as we've all talked about, various reasons for keeping parts of it around. Certainly jobs is one, and there's been several studies that have been done that pointed out that all jobs are not the same, and that the average pay for energy jobs, whether it's upstream or downstream, is considerably higher than a job on installing solar panels, whether they're utility scale or they're on the roof of somebody's house. So you need more of those renewable jobs to balance off any job losses that occur as a result of changes in the industry structure. The other thing that's important to think about is that in many of our communities, the tax base is largely driven by industrial property taxes. And to the degree that you damage that tax base, certain things become more expensive, and you lose a refinery, you not only lose the jobs, but you lose the tax base that's paying for the schools and the roads and a lot of the other things that your community is interested in. And that's not just true about Louisiana. If you look at Governor Cuomo's problems in New York, notice that he's very much against the Indian Point nuclear power station, but he's very much for the ones that are up in single rural counties along the Great Lakes because they're the only jobs in town. So jobs and property taxes that are sustaining or supporting parish level activities need to be stressed when we're having these outreach meetings or these community involvement events, to make sure they understand what's at risk when they come out and insist on accelerated changes in the energy makeup of their particular location.
Thanks for raising those considerations, Eric. And that goes back to an earlier point that Karen made, and I thought was really interesting, on empowering renewable energy and industries through subsidies and mechanisms that create the strong regulation of pollutants. And that goes back to a conversation we had on advancing research this morning. And I have a few people that might be able to help you build out that idea, Karen, or that I can connect you with, so we can begin to think through what some of those mechanisms might look like. They're more on the technical side, so your legal expertise would really help.
That would be great. I would really like that.
Perfect. Great. I'll do that.
And Eric, I don't know, did you have any suggestions for how we could kind of do a better job at kind of getting at some of these issues? I know we're going to be thinking about trade-offs and consequences as we kind of move through this process, but are there other thoughts you have on kind of honing in on where, you know, which communities or parishes might be most kind of at the intersection of some of these different issues?
Oh, I think all of the river parishes, for starters. Lake Charles also would be an area, but generally I would say that the southern energy corridors parishes are the ones that are most affected.
Karen, do you have a thought? Yeah, please.
I actually have a question for the economist. One thing that occurred to me in thinking about the differences between cap and trade, I mean, the problem with market-based mechanisms generally is that they necessarily involve uncertainty. So with cap and trade, the uncertainty surrounds price. You have a cap, so you have certainty in terms of your emission goal. Carbon pricing, you have certainty in terms of your price, but not how much you're going to reduce. In terms of thinking about inadequacies of market-based approach, uncertainty, but then the relative uncertainties between price and overall emissions, do you have a sense of whether one is preferable? Just weighing those, thinking how to think intelligently about those two uncertainties. Does that make sense? Is my question framed in a way that makes sense?
I'll jump in at least briefly. I think the question makes perfect sense, and I think you're describing just sort of a classic public policy trade-off, you know, and that is with each of those systems, you are going to be more directly targeting one of those two kind of competing objectives, and so I think it's sort of a policy decision as to which may be preferable. Now, you can get a little more complex with the design of a particular program and create something that's maybe a little bit more like a hybrid program, such as a tax regime that does have specific benchmarks, or even a cap and trade regime with certain rules regarding costs or the price within which things trade within that market.
I think there's one other danger to keep in mind too, Karen, which is that we tend to put are overconfident when it comes to putting barriers around a particular policy. So that if we say this policy relates to the United States, that's great, but it doesn't affect France, and France can do whatever France wants, and Germany can do whatever Germany wants. And even within the EU, there are issues between the nation states there. So your policies can have negative effects. California is a pretty good example of what's happened. Go see how many new refineries have been built in California in the last 30 years. And that's not to put Stacy in a bad position. I'm just saying that even though they are the U.S. leaders in terms of producing heavy crude oil, they're making it very difficult to get out of the ground and turn into a useful product. So there are consequences beyond the range of your political, legal or policy decisions that you just have to recognize when you go into these design exercises.
Well, does anybody have any other final thoughts as we kind of transition into kind of the last step and then the public comment period today?
Hey, Charles, just an idea that just to put it out, it's a short idea, which is it may be a while, even though there is certainly a lot more talk about climate action in the country. But it also strikes me that there are a number of companies who are trying to reduce, trying to move forward. And I wonder if there's not something that we should do in Louisiana, which would, since we've got a baseline, largely a baseline, particularly for the large emitters, whether we should have some kind of a program that could establish credit for early reductions. In other words, begin to create incentives to support people who are reducing emissions from their current baselines or something like that, to sort of, it's partly an incentive approach and partly a disincentive. It removes a disincentive. If somebody doesn't want to do something they think might be a competitive disadvantage if other people aren't going to do it. But if they were getting credit against a future regulatory scheme or something like that, I don't know. I don't know that would necessarily work, but it's just a thought as we try to figure out what we're actually going to do, whether we could help people who are doing stuff now. So just a thought.
Steve, that's a good thought, but what it creates is called as something as a moral hazard issue. So what a moral hazard is, if a company or an entity wants to do a particular practice that could be environmentally beneficial, but an expectation of an incentive would delay that practice. And that's quite common in agricultural conservation practices, and it might creep into the industry practices as well in some cases, but not a bad thought though.
Well, I think that's one of many issues that probably needs some follow-up. So we can get, Lindsay and I can kind of help connect some people together, like she mentioned earlier, and see what other next steps might make the most sense.
I think that's a great idea, and I would just reiterate that we really appreciate all of your feedback and input from the different committees and groups that have been willing to have this discussion on the financial and equity and legal considerations that are necessary in building out any carbon pricing. And we identified this as one of it was something raised in a few of our groups, but also didn't want it to be this gap that fell through the cracks, since it doesn't fit quite squarely in one of the sector committees. So in having this conversation that brings together a lot of voices, it really helps us enhance how we're considering and thinking about these different mechanisms. So yes, we'll be glad to build those connections moving forward.
And then, so in just a second, we're going to get to public comment, but I'm just going to remind folks kind of where everything is kind of as a wrap up. So again, we've got a couple weeks till the action proposals are due if you're working on those, or if you've been inspired to write a new one after today. We're also going to be sending out the evaluation piece to the advisory groups next week with office hours to follow. And then this is largely for the public, if they're following along, or anybody who's kind of lost this webpage. But there are different ways to turn in these actions. We've got a template you can send in to email. We've got a Google form. And the templates are in a couple different languages, in Spanish and Vietnamese. We also have a mailing address if that's easier for you. That's all here. This is also all on our website on the governor's page for that. And then with that, so I guess the last little step too, this is, just one part of a larger process that we're going through. And so as these ideas are coming in, they're going to be kind of sorted and kind of handed back out to their to the sector committees to kind of look at again. There's going to be a process to evaluate these different portfolios against the fundamental objectives that the task force and all the different associated groups have kind of developed together. We're going to have a chance to revise actions based on those kinds of feedback, and then there will be a larger trade-off analysis later on before there's a final report. So there are a lot of steps left to go, but this part we're in now, this developing actions, is super important, and it's been really good to see all the different ideas that are kind of coming together on this already. So this has been great. And then with that, I'm going to see if I have any public participants in the following along. Any attendees, if you're an attendee on this meeting and you'd like to speak and raise your hand, thank you. Logan's showing us how it's done. Logan, I'm going to allow you to talk. And then if anybody else would like to speak in the who's an attendee, please just use that raise hand function for now. Go ahead, Logan.
Hey there, this is Logan Burke with the Alliance for Affordable Energy. Thanks so much for the opportunity to make a comment. I had a couple and then also a question. The first comments I want to make are about unintended consequences. And that is, we are already experiencing unintended consequences of policies that have existed for an awfully long time, including those that pull money out from under communities and municipalities, like the ITEP and like other kinds of policies that are being presented at the legislature right now that would, in many cases, totally wipe out the kinds of revenues that were being described that come from oil, gas, and petrochemical manufacturing. And so I think we need to be very thoughtful about the fact that already many of our communities have lost a lot of the kinds of supports that they should have had had Louisiana been more supportive of communities and not of those businesses. And then second, I want to point out that while there's a lot of conversation about the jobs that we will need to transition away from traditional or conventional oil, gas, and petrochemical manufacturing, I think it's important to also recognize that a lot of those jobs are not just in the oil field, for example, or even inside the plants, they're construction jobs. And there are an awful lot of new infrastructure construction jobs that will be needed over the course of this transition, and that we know that the federal government itself is very interested in investing in. And so I think we should really consider the kinds of programs that Louisiana could do that include those kinds of construction jobs that are not necessarily in the oil and gas industry, but, for example, could very much include coastal restoration and making our state more resilient. And then the second or the last piece that I have is a question, which is again about unintended consequences. I'm curious if Charles, you made a point a bit earlier about looking at the various trade-offs with different kinds of portfolios. And I'm curious if the look at those trade-offs will include some analysis of the health costs and implications of the status quo and the continued build out of the fossil fuel and petrochemical industries in our state, as compared to the health costs and impacts that would result from a transition away from those things. Because I think we do know that there are a lot of costs that Louisiana is paying, both in basic health costs and even in morbidity as a result of those industries. And so thinking about what are the ways that we can actually save money for our state and think differently about those impacts on the beneficial side. So the question, to be very clear, is, are those kinds of impacts, those potential benefits on the health side, going to be analyzed as part of the conversation and the trade-offs?
Yes, Logan, that's a great question. I appreciate you raising that. And that will be a consideration. So we're building out the evaluation criteria of taking those fundamental objectives that the task force and all of your groups worked through in the beginning of this process, and then developing criteria of how do we evaluate that? What is the standard way of evaluating those different objectives? And so the health impacts are very integral in many of those. I'm trying to remember them off the top of my head, but creating an equitable society and community impact. Colleen might have to help me on the specific names of those objectives, but I really appreciate you raising that point, and that will absolutely be a consideration and evaluation.
I do want to just kind of, there's a question of the degree to which we can quantify these things in a way that's going to be like really.
It's 3 o'clock.
According to the tools that we have, so I think we're doing our very best to kind of include that kind of question and evaluation into it, but there's going to be a limit to how well we can kind of put a dollar sign or a lives or a hospital visits to that, depending on the tool that we have at our disposal, I think. So, but I think it's a really, again, just really important point. Appreciate you bringing that up, Logan.
Thank you.
Is anybody else on the attendees list want to raise their hand and make a public comment? Okay, I'm going to check the email that I have one more time. We don't have any public comment in the email, so I think that this is a really fabulous conversation. I really appreciate everybody's time. This is a really expert group from so many different angles. I really thank you for all the work and time you've given to this effort, and really just appreciate seeing you here today. We thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next meeting.